The street was packed. People lined the sidewalks, families huddled together, children perched on their parents' shoulders. Laughter mixed with the sound of drums from the marching band. It wasn't just another day, it felt like everyone had shown up for this celebration. Flags were everywhere, waving back and forth, carried by the crowd's excitement. You could feel it, the kind of energy that only comes when people are truly happy to be part of something bigger than themselves. Near the front, there was a little black girl, no more than 7. She was standing with her mom, clutching a small flag. Her coat looked a size too big for her, and she kept pulling it up as she tried to see what was happening on the street. Her face was serious, but her eyes lit up every time a group of performers passed by. She didn't move much, she just stood there, watching, like she didn't want to miss a single second. And then, out of nowhere, it happened. A soldier in uniform, walking close to the crowd, didn't notice her. He moved quickly, his shoulder hitting her as he passed. She stumbled and hit the ground hard. It wasn't loud, but enough for people nearby to notice. A hush spread. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Everyone turned to see what had just happened. The girl didn't cry right away. She looked shocked, like she couldn't quite process what had just happened. Slowly, she tried to get up, her little hands pressing into the pavement. Her flag was on the ground now, crumpled next to her. She reached for it, but her focus kept shifting between the faces staring at her and the scrape on her knee. A single tear rolled down her cheek before she wiped it away. The soldier paused. He looked down at her, unsure what to do. For a moment, it seemed like he might lean down to help her, but he didn't. He hesitated, and in that hesitation, everything felt heavier. Around them, people whispered. Some were pointing, others looked angry, but most just watched, waiting to see what would happen next. High above the crowd, on a platform overlooking the parade, stood Donald Trump. Fresh off his November 2024 election win, he had been waving at the crowd moments earlier. But now, his hand was still. His expression gave nothing away. Some people turned their attention to him, wondering if he'd do something. For a moment, it felt like everyone in Trump, the soldier, the crowd, was holding their breath. Before I tell you what happened next, let us know where you're watching from. Share your thoughts in the comments, and while you're here, go ahead and like this video and subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss the rest of this story. Now, let's go back to that moment. What happened next changed everything. The girl stood up slowly, her scraped knee trembling as she balanced herself. Her tiny hands brushed at the dirt on her coat, but her eyes betrayed the sting of embarrassment more than the pain. Around her, the whispers grew louder. "Did he even notice?" someone said softly. A woman nearby stepped forward, kneeling beside the girl, gently asking if she was okay. The soldier stood frozen, his posture stiff, as though unsure whether stepping forward would make things better or worse. The parade marched on, but the focus shifted. Eyes darted between the soldier and the girl, the energy in the crowd shifting from celebration to discomfort. A moment that should have been about pride now felt heavier. It wasn't about a scrape or a fall anymore, it was the pause, the silence, and the questions hanging unspoken in the air. On the platform, Donald Trump's gaze remained fixed on the scene. His hand, which had been raised to wave moments ago, now rested on the railing in front of him. He turned to one of his aides, muttering something under his breath, but his expression didn't change. The crowd near the platform began to stir, watching him, waiting for a signal, a word, anything to acknowledge what they had just seen. Would he step in? Would he address it? Or was it too small a moment for someone in his position? The woman beside the girl helped her to her feet fully, brushing off the last of the dirt. "You're okay, sweetheart," she said softly. The girl nodded, her lip trembling, but she didn't say a word. She clutched her little flag tightly, now wrinkled and dirty, but she didn't let go of it. A man nearby stepped forward, glaring at the soldier. "You should apologize," he said, his tone firm but not loud. The soldier didn't respond, just glanced at the girl and then back at the man. For a moment, everything seemed stuck. The parade continued, but the music felt muted. People kept turning their heads toward the platform, where Trump remained standing, watching. The anticipation was almost tangible, but he didn't move right away. Instead, he looked down at the girl, then back at the soldier. The tension grew heavier. What would he do? Would he ignore it altogether? And if he didn't, how would he handle it? It wasn't just about the girl or the soldier anymore, it was about how this moment would linger in the minds of everyone watching. This is the kind of story that makes you think. What would you have done in that situation? Would you have spoken up? Helped the little girl? Or would you have waited, like so many others, for someone else to take the lead? The soldier's steps had been deliberate, his focus fixed ahead. He hadn't noticed the little girl standing so close to the edge of the sidewalk, her small frame easily overshadowed by the crowd around her. When he brushed past, it was with the weight and momentum of someone used to moving through dense spaces without stopping. The impact was quick but enough to send her stumbling backward, her feet unable to catch her balance before she landed on the pavement. The fall wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to draw eyes. Her small hand instinctively reached for her knee, her fingers brushing against the scrape that had already begun to sting. Tears formed in her eyes, not loud sobs, but the quiet kind of crying that comes from feeling overwhelmed and unsure. She looked down at her flag, now crumpled and dirted, and carefully picked it up, as if holding it tightly might somehow make everything feel normal again. Around her, the whispers began almost immediately. "Did you see that?" one voice asked. Another murmured, "He didn't even stop to help her." People's reactions varied. Some looked concerned, their eyes scanning her for any serious injury. Others seemed hesitant, unsure if stepping in would only draw more attention to her or make her feel worse. A few glanced at the soldier, their expressions a mix of frustration and disbelief. "Was it really just an accident?" someone muttered under their breath. The question lingered, unspoken but felt. The soldier turned slightly, his movements rigid, as if he wasn't sure whether to acknowledge what had happened or continue walking. His eyes flicked to the girl, then to the crowd. For a moment, he opened his mouth, as though to say something, but no words came. He adjusted the strap of his uniform and straightened up, his face carefully blank. The silence that followed was louder than any words he might have spoken. The girl looked up, her wide eyes scanning the faces around her. She didn't say anything either, just held onto her flag as tightly as her small hands could manage. The woman who had helped her earlier stayed close, her hand resting gently on the girl's shoulder. "You're okay, sweetheart," she whispered, her tone kind but uncertain, as though she wasn't entirely convinced herself. And then, as if drawn by the shift in the atmosphere, more eyes turned toward the platform where Donald Trump stood. He hadn't moved. His posture was steady, his hands resting lightly on the railing. From a distance, it was hard to tell what he was thinking, but it was clear he'd seen everything. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, the tension rising. People weren't just waiting for the soldier to do something anymore, they were waiting for him. What would you have done if you were there? Would you have spoken up, or would you have stayed silent like so many others? The girl's small hands pressed against the ground as she tried to lift herself, her face tight with effort and pain. Her knee, now scratched and raw, trembled as she put weight on it. She flinched, her breath catching in her chest, but no sound came out. A woman knelt beside her, her voice soft but urgent, "Sweetheart, are you okay?" The girl didn't answer immediately, her wide eyes scanned the faces in the crowd, looking for something, maybe reassurance, maybe her mother. The bystanders' question seemed to hang in the air unanswered, and the silence made it all feel heavier. Those closest to the scene glanced at each other uneasily. Some stepped forward, others stayed frozen, their expressions torn between concern and hesitation. In the back of the crowd, someone murmured, "Would this have happened if she wasn't a little black girl?" The words weren't loud, but they carried far enough for heads to turn, and the murmurs grew louder. The girl, still holding her crumpled flag, finally looked up at the woman. Her lip quivered, but she swallowed hard and nodded. "I'm fine," she whispered, though the scrape on her knee and the tears in her eyes told a different story. Her voice, so quiet and unsure, felt like a contrast to the noise and energy of the parade just moments before. The soldier, still standing a few feet away, seemed to realize the weight of what had just happened. His hand shifted toward his belt as if adjusting his posture would somehow make it less awkward. He looked at her again, then glanced at the people watching him. For a brief moment, it seemed like he might step forward and say something, but he didn't. Instead, he tightened his jaw and turned his attention back to the marching line ahead, as though nothing had happened. The crowd didn't let it go so easily. Whispers turned into hushed conversations. A man in the front said firmly he should apologize. Someone else chimed in, would he have ignored it if it had been another child? The questions weren't just about the soldier anymore. They were about something deeper, something that felt uncomfortable to voice but impossible to ignore. And yet, through all of this, the girl stayed quiet. She clutched her flag, her knuckles pale from how tightly she held it. It wasn't clear if she was holding back tears or simply unsure of what to do. The woman next to her placed a hand on her back and said gently, "Let's get you cleaned up." But the girl didn't move. Her eyes flicked to the platform where Donald Trump stood, watching. He hadn't looked away once. His expression was unreadable, his posture rigid, but his attention never wavered. People in the crowd began to notice his stillness, their gazes shifting from the girl to him. They didn't know what they expected, but they couldn't help but wait. Would he act? Would he say something? Or would this moment pass like so many others, unseen, unspoken, and unresolved? What would you have done if you were there? Would you have stepped in? Would you have waited for someone else to? The murmurs in the crowd didn't fade. Instead, they grew louder, filling the tense silence that the soldier's hesitation had left behind. A man near the front, arms crossed tightly over his chest, shook his head. He just walked away. Like it didn't even matter, he said to no one in particular. Another voice, this one sharper, cut through, "What kind of example is that?" He could have just helped her up. People's reactions were a mix of disbelief and quiet anger. Some turned their attention to the girl, whose small frame seemed even smaller under the weight of the stairs. Others focused on the soldier, now blending back into the marching line, his back rigid and face unreadable. "It wasn't that hard to stop for 2 seconds, a woman muttered, her voice low but biting. The crowd wasn't shouting or pointing, but their expressions spoke louder than words. Frustration lingered in their eyes, their hands gesturing subtly as they talked among themselves. And yet, amid the growing tension, there were those who didn't seem sure how to feel. One bystander leaned toward another and asked quietly, "Do you think it was just an accident? I mean, he probably didn't even see her." The response came in a whisper, "Maybe. But still, look at her. That's a child." The little girl stood there, her scraped knee now smeared with dust, still holding onto her flag. She didn't cry anymore, but the confusion on her face hadn't lifted. Her small hands clenched the flag tightly, as if holding onto it gave her some sense of control in a moment where everything else felt uncertain. The woman who had helped her gently brushed her coat, trying to offer comfort, but the girl's eyes didn't meet hers. Instead, her gaze drifted again toward the platform. Donald Trump was still standing, unmoving, watching everything unfold. His expression gave nothing away. From where he stood, he could see it all, the girl, the soldier, the crowd's shifting emotions. The weight of the moment seemed to rest heavily in the space between him and the scene below. Those standing closer to the platform began to notice his stillness. They exchanged glances, wondering what he was thinking or if he was thinking anything at all. A child's voice broke through the quiet murmur of the crowd. "Mom, is he going to say something?" The question was innocent, but it hung in the air like a challenge. A few people turned toward the platform again, their expressions now expectant. It was as though the girl's fall had transformed into something bigger, a test, perhaps, of what leadership looks like in small, unexpected moments. "What do you think? Should he have said something right then? Or was it better to wait? Let us know what you'd have done." The platform above the parade was a perfect vantage point. From there, Donald Trump could see the entire scene unfolding. His eyes fixed on the girl, her small frame standing out in the chaos of the moment. His hand rested on the railing, motionless, while the whispers of those around him blended into the ambient noise of the parade. He didn't speak. He didn't gesture. He just stood there. People began to notice. Faces in the crowd turned toward him, expressions shifting from curiosity to expectation. It was as if the weight of the moment had shifted entirely onto his shoulders. For a man used to commanding attention, his silence felt almost out of place. Was he waiting? Thinking? Or simply choosing not to act? The murmurs near the platform grew louder. Is he going to do something? A man asked his wife, his voice tinged with impatience. He's seen everything, what's he waiting for? Another whispered, maybe he doesn't want to make it worse. The questions were spoken softly, but they carried through the crowd like a chain reaction, each one amplifying the tension. Trump's expression remained neutral, his features carefully controlled. There was no hint of anger, no visible sign of concern, just an unwavering gaze fixed on the scene below. It was impossible to tell what he was thinking, and that only added to the growing anticipation. Was he calculating his next move? Or was this simply his way of letting the moment play out without interference? As the girl stood quietly, clutching her flag, more eyes followed Trump's gaze. The scene seemed frozen in time, the parade continuing around them like a moving backdrop to a moment that felt strangely intimate, despite the size of the crowd. The question wasn't just about what Trump would do, it was about what this moment meant. Would it become a symbol of indifference? Or something else entirely? In times like this, actions or the lack of them can speak louder than words. What would you have expected if you were there? Would you have wanted him to speak up, or to step back and let others take charge? The air felt heavier as Donald Trump reached the last step, his polished shoes hitting the ground with a quiet thud. The crowd, now eerily still, shifted their attention entirely to him. No one could guess what he might do, and that uncertainty made every movement feel significant. His steps were slow, purposeful, and his face remained unreadable, offering no clues to his thoughts. People near the front leaned forward, their voices hushed but insistent. Why's he walking down? What's he planning to do? A man whispered. A woman beside him shook her head slightly, her expression skeptical. Maybe he's just coming to wave people off, like always. But this time, it wasn't a routine gesture. There was intent in the way Trump moved, not rushed, not hesitant, but deliberate, like someone who understood the gravity of being watched. The little girl, still clutching her flag, finally noticed him. Her wide eyes followed his approach, a mixture of confusion and curiosity flickering across her face. She stayed still, as if uncertain whether she was supposed to do something. The woman beside her, who had been trying to comfort her, glanced toward Trump as well, her brows furrowed as though she, too, was trying to decode his intentions. As he got closer, the soldier who had bumped into the girl straightened instinctively. His posture was rigid now, and his gaze flicked nervously between the girl and Trump. The crowd's whispers turned into murmurs, growing louder as more people noticed the unfolding scene. What's he going to say? Someone asked. Is he going to call out the soldier? Another voice chimed in, do you think he'll just talk to the kid and leave it at that? The speculation only added to the anticipation, the sense that something important was about to happen. When Trump stopped, he was just a few steps from the girl. He looked down at her, not with a grand gesture or an exaggerated smile, but with a kind of stillness that made it clear he wasn't in a hurry. For a moment, it seemed like time had paused, the noise of the parade fading into a distant hum. The girl's hands tightened around the flag, her eyes meeting his briefly before darting away. She looked nervous, unsure if she should speak first or if she was even supposed to. The crowd, now holding its collective breath, waited for what would happen next. This kind of tension only raises more questions. Was this moment about offering comfort? About setting an example? Or was it about something deeper, something unsaid but felt by everyone watching? The crowd's murmur grew restless, a wave of speculation sweeping through as Donald Trump stopped just a step away from the little girl. His stillness was unsettling, not because it was intentional, but because it made everyone else feel the weight of the moment. All eyes were on him now, waiting, wondering, questioning. The soldiers standing in formation nearby stole glances in his direction, their discipline giving way to curiosity. Even the music from the parade seemed to have dimmed, as though the scene demanded its own space. The woman beside the girl straightened slightly, her protective instincts kicking in. She shifted closer to the child, her hand brushing lightly against the girl's shoulder, as if to remind her that she wasn't alone. A young man in the crowd, holding his phone up to record, whispered to the person beside him, "Do you think he's actually going to say something? Or just walk away?" Trump's expression remained as unreadable as ever. His gaze stayed on the girl, his presence now commanding the attention of every bystander nearby. The girl, to her credit, didn't shrink back. She stood there, her scraped knee forgotten, her small flag still held tightly in her hand. Her wide eyes flicked between Trump and the people watching her, the weight of their attention unmistakable. The crowd was split, some waited with bated breath, believing this was a moment that could change the tone of the entire day. Others seemed skeptical, their folded arms and faint frowns betraying their doubt. A middle-aged man near the front muttered, "It's just for the cameras. He's going to say a few words and move on." Still, Trump didn't move. The pause dragged on just long enough to make the silence feel heavier. What could he possibly say that would matter now? Would his words be for the girl, for the crowd, or for himself? And why had he chosen to come down from the platform at all? The bystanders weren't just watching, they were interpreting, trying to draw their own conclusions about what this moment meant. Was this leadership? Was it performance? Or was it something no one could fully understand until it played out? What would you be thinking if you were standing in that crowd? Would you feel inspired, or would you question his intentions? The air buzzed with whispers, though no one dared to speak too loudly. Conversations rippled through the crowd in hushed tones, their words carrying a weight that made the moment even more tense. A woman near the front leaned toward her friend, her voice just loud enough to catch the attention of those around her. "Would this have happened if she wasn't a black girl?" she asked, her expression a mix of anger and resignation. The question lingered in the air, unanswered but undeniably present. Not far away, a man crossed his arms, shaking his head slightly. The soldier didn't even hesitate, he muttered. Did he even see her? Or did he just not care enough to stop? His tone wasn't accusatory, but the frustration was clear. A few heads turned toward him, nodding in quiet agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably, as if the thought had crossed their minds but they weren't ready to voice it. Further back, a younger man, phone still in hand, spoke more cautiously. "I mean, maybe it was just an accident," he said, his words trailing off as though even he didn't fully believe them. His companion frowned, glancing at the little girl, who still stood clutching her flag. "It's not just about the fall," she said softly. "It's about how no one reacted until now." The murmurs continued, weaving through the crowd like a thread connecting their thoughts. Some people questioned the soldier's actions or lack of them. Others wondered why Donald Trump had come down at all. "Does he actually care?" one woman asked quietly, her eyes fixed on Trump's figure as he stood in front of the girl. "Or is this just for show?" These weren't just surface-level questions. They dug into something deeper, something uncomfortable yet unavoidable. Conversations about race and privilege simmered just beneath the surface. For many, this moment wasn't just about a child being knocked down, it was about how that moment was handled. It was about the unspoken rules of who gets seen and who gets overlooked. But not everyone shared the same perspective. A middle-aged man in the crowd, clearly irritated, waved a dismissive hand. "Come on," he said, his voice louder than most. "Why does everything have to be about race? It was an accident. Let it go." His words drew a few nods, but they also earned sharp glances from others who clearly didn't agree. The woman beside the little girl knelt again, brushing dirt from her coat. Her voice was low but steady as she said, "You're okay. Just hold your flag. Don't let go." Her tone carried something beyond comfort, it carried a kind of defiance, as though holding onto that flag was about more than just pride. "What about you? How do you see this moment? Do you think it's fair to question whether race or privilege played a role, or do you think it's reading too much into a simple accident?" The crowd's whispers softened, replaced by a tense silence. Donald Trump stood just a few feet from the little girl now, his presence towering yet oddly restrained. The woman next to her kept her hand on the child's shoulder, her protective stance unmistakable. The girl glanced up again, her fingers gripping the stick of her flag so tightly her knuckles turned pale. Her scraped knee, though small, was still visible, and it seemed to draw every ounce of attention in the moment, perhaps because it symbolized something more than a fall. Somewhere in the crowd, a man muttered, "It's not just about the accident. It's about what happens next." His companion nodded, her expression serious. If it were someone else, someone different, would this have even happened? Nearby, another voice spoke up, softer but no less pointed. "You think he's actually going to do something meaningful? Or is this just for the cameras?" The conversations were fractured but carried an undercurrent of frustration, a kind of unspoken awareness that moments like these didn't happen in a vacuum. Yet, not everyone agreed. A middle-aged man standing with his arms crossed shook his head. "People are making this into more than it is," he said, his tone dismissive. "It was just an accident. Nothing more." But the eyes of the crowd told a different story. This wasn't just about the fall, it had become something larger, a flashpoint for conversations that were often ignored or sidestepped. People weren't just watching Donald Trump, they were evaluating him. Each step he took felt deliberate, every moment of silence amplifying the anticipation of what he might say or not say. The girl hadn't moved much, though her grip on her flag loosened slightly as her focus shifted between Trump and the ground in front of her. She wasn't crying anymore, but her quietness spoke volumes. The scrape on her knee might have been small, but to her, this moment was anything but. She seemed to feel the weight of all those eyes, as though she'd unintentionally become the center of something far bigger than herself. As Trump took another step forward, the air grew heavier. Some in the crowd leaned in, holding their breath, while others turned to each other, whispering nervously. "If he doesn't say anything, it's going to speak volumes," someone murmured. Another added, "But even if he does, what's it going to mean? Will it be enough?" The moment had transformed into something more. It wasn't just about a scraped knee or a soldier's mistake, it had become a reflection of the unspoken questions many carried with them: who gets noticed, who gets ignored, and what it means when someone finally chooses to act. What would you want to see in a moment like this? A speech? A gesture? Or something entirely different? Donald Trump took one last step forward, closing the space between himself and the little girl. The air felt almost still, the weight of everyone's eyes locked on the two figures now standing just feet apart. The girl glanced up at him, her expression still guarded, unsure of what to expect. The hand holding the flag twitched slightly, her grip loosening but never letting go. Then, in a move no one had anticipated, Trump knelt down. It wasn't hurried or theatrical, it was deliberate, almost quiet, as though he wanted to meet her at her level, not towering over her like everyone else. The crowd collectively held its breath as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a neatly folded handkerchief. He extended it to her gently, his voice low but clear as he asked, "Are you okay?" The girl hesitated, her small hands uncertain as they hovered near the handkerchief. She looked at him, then at the woman beside her, before finally taking it. Her voice was barely a whisper, but she managed to say, "Yes." Trump nodded slightly, a faint smile crossing his face before he stood again, this time turning to face the crowd. He raised his hand to signal for quiet, though the crowd was already silent, hanging on his every move. His voice carried across the space, calm but firm. "This is a moment we shouldn't ignore," he began. "Every child, every person, matters in this country. No one should ever feel unseen. Not here. Not anywhere." The applause started slowly, scattered claps from a few people in the front. But it grew quickly, rippling through the crowd as more joined in. Some stood quietly, their faces unreadable, while others nodded, their expressions softening. The moment was raw and unexpected, and it seemed to strike people in different ways. Phones were everywhere, their screens glowing as people captured the scene. A man near the front shook his head as he filmed, saying to no one in particular, "That was surprising. I didn't expect that." Another, standing a few feet away, leaned toward his friend. "Do you think he really meant it, or was it just for the cameras?" The skepticism was clear, but so was the sense of awe that something had happened when no one thought it would. The girl still stood there, the handkerchief now folded in her hands. She looked at Trump as he stepped back slightly, and for a brief moment, their eyes met again. There was something unspoken in the exchange, a quiet understanding that didn't need words. The woman beside her finally spoke, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. "Thank you. As Trump returned to the platform, the crowd's reactions remained mixed. Some applauded louder, cheering his words, while others exchanged whispers, their expressions thoughtful or skeptical. But the moment stayed with everyone, lingering like a question they couldn't quite answer. What had they just witnessed? A genuine act of kindness, or something else entirely? If you were there, what would you think? Was it a moment of true compassion, or was it calculate? As the applause softened and the crowd began to settle, the weight of what had just happened hung in the air. The little girl stood silently, still clutching the handkerchief Trump had given her, while the woman beside her gently guided her back toward the edge of the crowd. For those who had witnessed it, the moment seemed to linger, etched into their minds like a question waiting to be answered. What had they really seen? Was this a simple act of kindness, or something more layered? Some in the crowd exchanged glances, quietly debating what they'd just experienced. It felt real, one woman said, her voice carrying a hint of hope. You could see it in the way he spoke to her. But someone nearby shook their head, their skepticism evident. It was for the cameras. It's always for the cameras. And yet, despite the differing opinions, there was no denying that the moment had struck a chord. It wasn't just about Donald Trump kneeling before the girl or the words he'd spoken to the crowd, it was about what those actions represented. For some, it was a reminder that even small gestures could carry immense significance. For others, it was a stark reflection of the expectations placed on leaders in moments like these. The crowd began to disperse slowly, but the conversations didn't stop. People spoke about the soldier's hesitation, the girl's quiet resilience, and Trump's unexpected response. Each person seemed to take something different from the moment, their interpretation shaped by their own perspectives and experiences. And now, it's your turn to reflect. What do you think? Was this a genuine display of compassion, or was it a carefully calculated move? How do moments like these shape the way we view leadership and responsibility? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, we want to hear your take on this. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to hit the like button and share it with others who might find it meaningful. And if you're looking for more stories that make you think, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Every story has the power to inspire, challenge, and connect us. This one, we hope, does all three. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.